Well, we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to get started here. I'm LeiLani Cauthen, your host, CEO and publisher at Learning Counsel Media and Research. We'll be kicking out this recording to our 310,000 reader audience. Normally there's thousands of people who watch the video, weirdly, sometimes at midnight in their time zone. But we want to have a discussion today for the EduJedi Leadership Society about teacher digital learning standards. So there's some new things that the EduJedi have pioneered, and we're going to have that conversation today. We have with us Erin Cooke so far, and Dr. Wendy Oliver, also Zach Simon from EdisonLearning, who are going to be bringing in the professional grade understanding of what's going on the commercial side as we walk through this conversation. We should also see Phillip Hutcherson join just in a little bit from Colorado Springs, we hope. Rachelle had to beg off about 5 minutes ago. She got pulled into something, which is what's kind of happening nationwide. There's a lot of roller coaster riding going on in schools and districts because, you know, they have a sudden surge of COVID or something happens and everybody gets pulled in different directions. So before we go into having Erin give us a little background on himself and what he does and what's happening up in Oregon, I want to just sort of put a envelope around the conversation. We're going to be talking about standards for teachers and focusing on filing, tagging, and naming, which is something that's really not being done well enough, and what we think about all that. But before we do, I want to have Wendy give a little bit of an intro, and then I'm going to come back to Erin for his intro, and then we'll dig in. So, Wendy, can you give us a little background?
Absolutely. Thank you, LeiLani, and thank you so much for allowing us to participate and be involved today. This is really quite an honor. So excited to be here. I'm the Chief Learning Officer with EdisonLearning, and believe it or not, we have been around for almost 3 decades, which seems crazy that this industry has been around for almost 30 years in online learning. EdisonLearning has online content and courses. We have middle school and high school courses, grades 6 through 12, over 150 courses. And, you know, really the difference in commercial grade content is that we have dedicated content experts, instructional designers, graphic artists that, you know, this is their full-time job. They're not also trying to balance teaching a class along with designing content and putting it together in a way that creates a great learning experience for students. In addition to that, we also have online teachers who are trained specifically to teach online. And Zach, who's with us, is actually the Assistant Director of Instruction and Student Services. And those teachers teach students in a multitude of states across the country. They are certified in multiple states and work directly with districts to provide offerings where districts may have a teaching shortage. Maybe they need a specific certification that they're not able to get. And so we work very closely. We also have guidance counselors on staff and do a lot of work with SEL. So very excited to be here. I know that we'll get an opportunity to show some examples of some of the things that we're talking about today with the teaching standards. And I hope that we can help put a visual around some of the pieces that we're talking about because so many of us are visual learners. So thank you again, LeiLani, and I will pass it back to you.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, we're going to show some visuals later about how things work in the more advanced system constructs. But I'm coming back to Erin first to give an intro, and then I know we're looking for Phillip. Erin, go ahead. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing?
Sure. My name is Erin Cooke, and I've been a teacher and an administrator in the state of Oregon for about 26 years now. And lately, I work at the Southern Oregon ESD. Oregon, for those of you who don't know, has a group of about 19 service regions that cover the entire state. Our particular service region works with 13 different districts. And essentially our roles are really geared around attempting to provide service to school districts, either that they can afford themselves or that they would just rather work in a collected aspect for. A lot of what I focus on is professional development and data management. So I work with them on how to use data warehousing and make data-driven decisions. I also work with them in developing ed tech, educational data or educational technology integration for instruction or for management of classrooms. And then I also work on providing professional development in a range of instructional practices, or for administrators, how to use that to do professional development of their own. I have a background in working in both brick and mortar and virtual schools, and now I'm working at an ESD. And I've been working with the Learning Council for a while now, just to kind of add in a little bit of how administrators might see things and how they might run things, and then to also work on hybridization and other pieces.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to hopefully lean on your knowledge as we go through this. So the discussion point is really around some new experience, digital learning experience standards for teachers, and we want to focus in the dictionary today about the issues around filing, tagging, and naming things. So this is a really big area for school districts, as they often have this bureaucratic structure to maybe buy some central software, but then they're really just letting every teacher do whatever they want more often than not, and it creates a little bit of a friction when you try to have one teacher find materials and they're searching with different names and maybe things were being tagged. So before I go into all of that, I see we have a new joiner, Phillip Hutcherson. Hi.
Hear me okay?
Yeah, good to have you. So you're K-12 Math and Science Instruction Specialist from Colorado Springs. So I just had Erin, who's the other educator, with us today. We're going to be missing Rachelle. She got pulled into an emergency. Can you give us a little background on what's happening for you in your district?
Sure. So the probably a couple of the primary things is we're trying to be an innovative district of just of really kind of moving more into almost an entire digital type curriculum, and really trying to provide students the opportunity to learn on various platforms, to be able to react and respond to more immediate feedback, so we can kind of help students kind of adapt and grow. At the end, we're really trying to also focusing on teaching teachers how to plan for learning rather than planning for teaching. That's probably our number one thing, is we're trying to focus on how do you plan for long-term retention in your instruction, rather than simply just teaching procedural steps and a bunch of memorization, and trying to make learning more meaningful in real life through experiential learning, through inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, project-based learning, and really focusing on the idea of utilizing brain science to focus on the long-term memory.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. That's awesome. Okay, so let me reframe what we're doing here. So we're going to be talking about these standards for teachers. They're a little cut above just sort of like, let's be good digital citizens and that kind of stuff. It's all about the digital learning experience. And we're going to focus in a little bit on filing, tagging, and naming. So the first part of the standards is that they have a purpose for a new responsibility level. A lot of like what you were just saying, Phillip, and I know that Erin spends most of his time, basically making sure people know what they're doing at the teaching level. So it does include this definition of what is a knowledge object. So as they're going along, trying to develop that experiential, personalized learning, whatever it is that they're trying to do, they're using all these bits and pieces that are digital now, mostly. So the number one thing first is that they're maintaining an organized filing structure. They're naming objects in such a way that other people can find them if they're in a shared repository and environment, because then, every teacher doesn't have to try to recreate the wheel. And they are focused on ready availability, not just for themselves, but for their students. So I want to just kick that off right there, and let's talk about it. I want to come back to Erin first. Erin, what are your thoughts on this area?
Well, I think there are a couple of different aspects to it that we probably ought to look at. So the first one might actually involve something as simple as like student records. Like, how do you have naming conventions for files related to students, especially if they're going to be in a shared drive? As more districts convert to like digital file folders, whether it's tied to their SIS or whether it's not tied to their SIS, it might be in something like SharePoint or another file construct. How do other people find those students, and how do you keep active students versus non-active students, or look for those? And that work was actually pretty challenging when I first moved to a virtual school. We had to have access to a lot of that stuff, and we had to develop on our SharePoint kind of filing constructs and naming conventions so that things could be easily found. And I think when you start saying, okay, it's not just you on your computer, but you're going to have resources that other people might use, then you get into a very different piece, because when we're talking about that, having to even have conversations with educators around, it's not about how you think, it's about how computers work sometimes. Something simple like dates. If you want to put a date into a file to give it an aspect of stuff, sometimes what we do is, we use the military dating structure, which starts with a 2-digit year. So it's, this would be, 210917 and not 091721, so just changing some of those concepts to say, why is that important? Well, it lays that out into a file in a different way so you can read it in order. Some things like standards, like if you're tagging something, like it's a video and you want to use that video and it's going to go on your media server, adding a tag for the standard number that is related to that particular file and having that be as a meta tag, even if it's not in the naming convention, it can be in a meta tag situation. So that when people do searches through the media server, being able to actually pull things up like that based off a standard number is actually easier than trying to say, well, I think it's about the standard that deals with, I have my geography themes and I want to look at, spatial relations. Well, if you've got a standard from the social studies standard, and you've got a language arts standard or a mathematic or a science standard that are based to those, you can add them as a meta tag. And then when somebody goes into the media server to say, I need to find some videos on this and I'm going for these standards, really all they have to do is, if you've taught them that, to say, just do a search and it should pull up the meta tags. So this really gets to a point where if you're saving things or having pools of knowledge or pools of resources, having consistency amongst how your staff actually name or tag those is important. If they understand the filing structure of where things go, that's important. And then also making sure that you train them on how to actually search for it. It's not very intuitive. I think a lot of times those of us who are fairly technically competent, who work in those kind of areas, really just, we have the shorthand, right? So we understand the inside baseball. So we'll get around that. We don't always we kind of take for granted that the people who are going to be working at this have that same, and they don't. I mean, most teachers really don't understand why you would, use different naming conventions, why you would use an underscore instead of a space, if you're going to put it on a web file. I mean, all those kinds of pieces are things that are just not intuitive to most teachers. And so it's important that you create context for that to go in, and then you train people on how to use it. Like I said, in our virtual program, we continued it all the way through now, and transitioning many districts that are using digital files, both for resources, but also for students and curriculum assets and other pieces. If you're using a SharePoint so that things don't move around, or, not putting it on my group, like if I have a Google folder and I put it on my Google folder and I share it to you, if something happens to me or my Google account, then all of a sudden all this stuff that you've tied your curriculum to might go away. Versus, those type of assets actually shouldn't go on personal drives. They should go on, group or shared drives, and having the conversation about why that is or other reasons. So those are some of the pieces that I would just kind of start with. I'm not exactly sure where you wanted to go, so I'll leave it there.
That's perfect. I want to comment that what I'm perceiving, and then I'm going to take it to Phillip, and then maybe Zach, maybe you can share kind of what's going on, professional grade stuff. What I'm observing is that you made this mention of, it's not only all about the individual teacher, it's about the group. And that right there is the demarcation line difference between how we normally have had teaching be. which was like, you're alone in your classroom. It's all about you. Your big file cabinets in the back of the room. Now, when you move to digital, there's this shared thing happening at scale. And it does cause a need for professional development aimed in the direction of thinking beyond yourself to think for the group, which is sort of a leap for a lot of teachers that have been teaching for a really long time. I'm just saying. All right. So, Phillip, what are your thoughts on this whole conversation?
Well, I'm still trying to follow exactly what the real question you really want to ask me is. I mean, I have lots of answers, but I want to make sure I understand what your real question is.
Well, we're talking about this standard of teachers maintaining an organized filing structure. And it has those permutations of being part of a group, as well as everything Erin just talked about, which is actually having naming conventions instituted in the organization. So what are your thoughts about all that?
And so are you referencing the idea, the concept of just organizing your files within, in terms of like student records and student data based on your lesson planning and just student performance? And
yeah, as a personal responsibility that also bleeds into a group responsibility. This is kind of new for a lot of people. You know, they didn't have to do that before.
yeah, I mean, but I guess, I mean, I guess when it comes to like naming files and stuff, I mean, I guess I don't know if I really see the. I guess for what purpose? I mean, I'm just trying to make sure I understand what we're really talking about. I'm making sure that what we're talking about is something that's going to impact student learning versus something that's. I mean, because I understand the concept of naming files and organizing your folders, and whether it be within SharePoint or with even if it's on your desktop or a U drive or some other different drive. I mean, and then to organize your content to be able to, whether it's going to be to organize instructional materials, organize student data, and be able to I guess. But I guess what are we really getting at? I guess that's. I want to make sure I know what we're really talking about here.
I may be able to hop in and give an example. I think in my situation, for example, it goes beyond the naming convention, right? It's are you going to allow teachers, if you don't have the naming conventions and the tagging and the filing in place, oftentimes what I have found is it becomes an issue around student data. So teachers may start saving things in their personal Google Drive, for example, instead of in their work or school Google Drive. And then you've got an issue with student data. Or let's say that happens and then a teacher leaves and then you don't have access to any of that information. Or if the teacher doesn't save it in SharePoint, or let's say the teacher does and then the teacher leaves, and then you need to be able to access that information, but the teacher who has tons of stuff in there, right? And you need to go in and find a particular document after that teacher leaves, but the teacher didn't follow a structure because maybe you didn't have one set up or organized, then you cannot for the life of you find a particular document that you're looking for. If there's a naming convention and if there's a filing or a tag, and I say this from experience, so no, I've experienced it the hard way, and then I figured out, okay, I've got to do something about this. If it's organized in such a way that you have set and structured, then you avoid those issues. Is that what you're getting at, LeiLani?
And I'm waiting for Erin to also answer for Phillip, because Erin has had oversight of what a lot of schools and districts are doing about this. So Erin, do you want to?
Well, I think I can better answer the question now.
Okay.
My district is actually large enough that we actually have our own software programs that we use that actually houses all of the data. And the district actually, whenever we have various assessments, they actually collect that assessment, and we just have to go down and go to a database and just be able to click a student. We can literally go to any school within the district, identify a specific student, and whether that student transfers from one school to another, we can click on that student, and it'll actually pull up every single assessment, every single document of that kid's grades, their assignments, their it'll pull up every single assessment they've ever taken, all the way from kindergarten all the way up through high school.
So, Phil, with that, you guys have to have a way of tying it most likely to a student ID or an SSID, right? So at some point,
that is correct. Yep, we have
each one of those
ID.
pieces of data has to be tagged. And that's actually what we're talking about, is like, what's the process that you set that up with? Now, if you've got
yeah, so we have a
the
student
funds,
ID. Yep. Every kid in the district has a student ID, and then that's how it gets tagged to that particular student, and it just follows them everywhere they go. So even if a kid leaves a district, let's say the kid leaves our district and then 2-3 years later comes back, they get the same student ID, so that all of their records from even, during the absence during that time, just fills in everything that they did when they were in our district previously.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, I think, Zach, do you want to kind of share? I'm going to go pull up the other the more expanded document too. So after this naming, tagging thing, there's also the responsibility of curation. That's actually aligning all your objects to standards or goals. And then also providing small group, whole group, project-based or hands-on learning experiences around or amongst courseware, if you're using courseware, including the professional development. So let's look at those three. So Zach, I think you want to show what the professional grade world is doing right now, and then we can analyze back and get comments from Erin and Phillip.
Sure, and I appreciate this conversation. I know that while waiting for the sharing ability here,
I think
for us,
you have sharing now.
Yep, for us too.
Doug, have you given him sharing? Okay, good. Yeah, you have it now.
With our instructional staff, we've actually instituted naming conventions for a collaborative inquiry cycle as well, which allows collaboration is just so different now than it was years ago, where our teachers can actually use those naming conventions to tag their data sets and their implementation strategies, and they're disseminating their research to each other so much quicker with those naming conventions in our filing systems and knowledge management that we have today. So just as just a overarching theme, a lot of our naming conventions and our learning objects are tagged in a nice, obviously in a user interface that you're seeing here. I'm going to show you quickly what our traditional view looks like, and this is kind of how things are set up in a linear fashion, where you can see, all of our learning objects are here, all of the files that are embedded within our content and curriculum are easily accessible by students in this system. Now, with our teaching staff, what we found to be extremely helpful for students, because this is fairly static, this curriculum is set. In order to make the curriculum more dynamic, obviously teachers need to come in and offer and curate resources for students and give them the ability to explore them at their own leisure and time. And so what a lot of our teachers have done is create websites or OneNotes where students can come in, whether it's 2 a.m. in the morning, whether they have to work, or it's 9 a.m. on a Monday or 12 p.m. on a Sunday. It doesn't matter. They can come in and explore. They can get their extra practice worksheets. They can get their extensions. And so teachers are out collecting resources and making sure that they're tagged and named appropriately so that students can navigate these resources on their own. And I think that's extremely important this day and age when students are looking for help. And while a teacher might not always be ready to help, they can certainly put together these repositories of worksheets and workbooks and extra resources for students so that they're always getting the help that they need. In our system, our teachers will also reach out to students in various ways. One of them being through newsletters that will give them tips and pointers, also give them career spotlights where they're interviewing people outside, but students can really explore and be creative on their own. I see, also opportunities to have that group instruction that I think we talked about too, LeiLani, and that's something that's extremely important. Students are also engaged with experiential learning. I think that was brought up multiple times, where they're actually going out in their community and preparing materials and bringing them back. This is an example of a project-based learning course that we have where students are learning and they're kind of building upon a project, and eventually they're going out into their community and experiencing it. And I think that this is, that's where the real impact is taking place in our curriculum, is when students are experiencing that learning and internalizing it, and then putting together a piece of work that they're proud of and that hits home with them and is relevant to their lives. I think I covered most of those three. Does that give us enough food for thought?
You gave me a thought here, and I'm going to take the screen back. Is one of the things you said is that couple things. The user interface displays tagging sometimes to the student. So if we're still thinking in a lot of instances as a teacher or a school district, right, where tagging, naming conventions are all about us as a teacher, bureaucracy, administration, and not about the student, we're not maybe understanding the digital transition. Digital transition has now bled the line between what is a teacher resource or teaching and what the student is now doing. Sometimes in project, they're doing, like you were showing, discovery-based learning, where the tagging now also encompasses accumulation by the teacher of additional objects that might be needed for personalization. So branch pathways. So that dynamic additional curation is supplemental personalization. It's doing things like extra practice or extension for self-navigation, which is now another dimension, like I just said, of why tagging and the user interface becomes critically important. So I want to come back to Erin next, and then Phillip, your comments on everything that was just said.
So I will say, I think part of this is really, we have to be careful about how much of the onus we put on teachers for understanding the background pieces to this. I mean, in all fairness, I'm not exactly sure if you just cold talk to most teachers and said, what's a meta tag when it comes to data, but they could really give you an understanding about that. And if they were asked to say, okay, so you're putting this file into the pool of resources and you need to go in and adjust the meta tags to add the standard key tags in there so that they have the standards. They would have any way how to do that. And yes, there's LMSs and there's different tools that could basically say, do you want to add tags? And they can kind of make it as a wizard version of that. I think we have to look at, first of all, just what's the background understanding for a teacher? Because I can tell you that the way you get resistance from teachers to do things is by not telling them why it's important. Now, if you tell them at least enough as to why it's important without trying to basically get them lost in the other parts, that's kind of the sweet spot. But you have to give them at least a purpose behind it. And the easiest way to do that is really to show them how it works with like a small group of students or like students over time or whatever it is. And my comment, I guess, to what you were talking about, LeiLani, was this idea of, this was a resource and I need to have this on here. We have to understand branch logic saying, if the student's looking for automatically pull up or at least top of the list, these types of things, so that they would get those first, or that this would be a short list for them to pick from. That type of asset tagging for kind of AI-based, self-support is something that it kind of needs to be trained into teachers a little bit, because they have to understand why it's even there. I mean, I've gone into people's folders when they're looking for something, and I kind of show them some tricks about how to find things they've been looking for that's been lost in their one folder with every single file at the top level, which is another problem. But then I can go up and I can look at those and I can see in the background data, well, this was a file that somebody gave to you that you renamed. And I mean, it looks right here that this is a Word file that might actually go back, 10 years when it started, and you guys have just updated it and done other things. And most teachers wouldn't even know why that's even there. Like, you ask yourself a question: why does Microsoft keep that? First history and names and initial people and starts off and all that. But I think part of that is we don't have the general digital literacy amongst the educators a lot for them to understand why this tagging and filing would be important. And because here's the thing, if they're not checking that, it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to have the machine know. The machine will just guess and it'll start pulling things out. But it might also just start pulling the ones that are done correctly and not really putting the ones in there that don't have much. Or worse, somebody could put in information that's not correct in there, and it will feed the kid something that's inappropriate for the lesson or whatever it is. So this idea of putting information, and when we talk about it, naming, naming is important when you're talking about where are my files and how many layers of folders and where do I put them so that they're accessible by everybody, not just a few people, or if I go away or get by a bus or whatever it is, they're still accessible. The other part, though, that for what you're talking about, LeiLani, this tagging aspect of adding information that's actually not seen to most people. Like most people, if you don't open up that file and look at those little tag constructs in there, you wouldn't know that that was for standard, 01.11.124. You wouldn't know that it was tied to that standard. But a teacher, if you could say, I'm looking for resources for that standard, it's going to pull up a list. They're going to look through them. And they may actually say, oh, I like these 3 of this list of 40. I want to put a tag in there for like a group of students. Like whatever I add as a tag to those 3 things, when those when a group of students or students ask a specific question, the computer knows, oh, it's not just this standard. It's this standard with this secondary tag, which means that these 3 are the ones that Cooke would like to be there first. So if they're in my class and they're looking for that standard, those 3 resources would either be at the top or they might be the only 3 that are displayed. So it's that concept of getting them to understand what type of information you might put tied to a resource, especially, so that once they get into all the resources that they could possibly get, that it's going to not overwhelm them with resources. It's going to basically pop up to the top, the main ones that I as an instructor want them to have.
Those are really excellent points. And what it's reminding me is that the distribution in the digital world is very different than distribution of knowledge in the analog world, where teacher said, read this chapter and now do this worksheet, take this quiz. It was chunked pieces of knowledge bled out over time. As soon as you get into the digital universe, you suddenly have all these new dimensions of how information can be relayed to the student, including that extreme customization that could be automated by digital for the student who needs it in a just-in-time way. It's a totally different dimension for teachers to think with. So I want to go next to, thank you, Erin, for that. Phillip, and I want to compliment you on entering this conversation with a focus on experiential learning, because I'm assuming during the pandemic, there was obviously a lot of social emotional reasons to, actually cause kids when they are back together to do more hands-on and feel part of community. That's probably maybe a little bit of the background of your thinking, but it's probably much deeper than that too. But where are you at with this conversation about providing this hands-on and all the things that, maybe a few things that Erin talked about?
Where are we at in terms of providing the hands-on experiences?
Yeah.
We're definitely getting more and more teachers. We're currently writing together essentially a blueprint learning framework that is designed to, we're coaching several dozen teachers across the district at various grade levels to really learn about the idea of, how do you really plan for an entire unit that focuses on the, like I talked about before, the long-term retention, and then towards the end of the unit, focusing on extending and applying that information in a more authentic learning experience. And when you have these learning units that typically last anywhere between 8 to 10 weeks, that the final 2 weeks is really about that extension and an application piece. and we're designing them so that they are in every subject area, and in some subject areas trying to really focus on towards the end of that learning experience, right before they do the extension and application piece, that we focus on the cross-disciplinary opportunities so that students can actually see how the various standards at the different subject areas actually interlock with each other, and trying to really focus on whether it be like, for example, in science, the biggest problem with science is we read about science a lot of times. We'll have readers and activities and worksheets, but really focusing on the fact that instead of doing that, really focus on doing science, right? So doing inquiry-based learning, projects, experiments, and really doing science rather than simply reading about science. When it comes to math, instead of just focusing on procedural steps of learning how to add fractions or how to find equivalent fractions or multiplying or dividing, rather than wasting our time focusing on procedural memorization of algorithms, focus on, what does division even mean? When would you ever have equivalent fractions? When would you ever add fractions in real life situations? What does that look like so that when a student, and then identifying projects that students can actually be a part of within the school and outside of the school and within the community, so that they're actually utilizing those skills to be able to achieve, solutions within the community. And so that's really what we're focusing on in building. When you get into English, we're focusing on, rather than just simply memorizing your punctuation and grammar, and really focusing on how do you communicate for different purposes, and how do you communicate, and how do you read, write, and communicate in different settings in order to write a formal letter to a CEO of a company requesting for donations for your school versus contacting a person in the community to come in as a guest speaker versus writing someone a thank you letter for their donation, and things like that, and really beginning to utilize these skills in meaningful ways. And when it comes to when I really think about what we're really trying to go to and towards the future, is when it comes to digital aspects, is how do we develop pathways that are going to be adaptive for students so that we can differentiate and group for students almost in a more of a personalized manner that aligns with our graduate profile that we've created on talking about what are the important skills that you really want students to be able to do, whether it be collaboration, an innovative problem solver, being able to, all of these different features where we're not just focusing on content, we're actually focusing on lifelong learning skills, including those soft skills that students need to be successful in the real world. So, I mean, that's really when I'm thinking about curriculum and instruction and focusing on what really matters. Those are the things that really matter, is how do we set up students for, whenever they go out into the real world, that they are prepared with the skills necessary for jobs that don't even exist yet. To me, that's what's really important. And so when I think about in reference to tagging and those kind of things, whenever Erin was talking about standards and codes, one of the things I've quickly learned in my new role, being an instruction specialist, is it kind of really blew my mind. I'm not going to lie, how many teachers don't even know what the standards are. I can ask a teacher, what are some of the things you need to teach at that grade level? And a teacher can tell me, at this grade level, I need to teach multiplication, I need to teach fractions. They can give me topics, they can give me content topics. But when you start talking to them about standards codes and having conversations with them about how would you look up the standards and what does that look like, the look on their face quickly changes. Because then all of a sudden now you're talking codes and you're talking numbers that are relating to the standards, and that's not a conversation that they're prepared to have. And some of these teachers are teachers who've been teaching for 20 years. And the fact that that if you started talking to them about a filing system of identifying standards that they need to teach and where to find those standards, as I start having those conversations with more and more teachers, it's like I'm bringing a whole new experience to them, which I don't know. I guess for being in the classroom and using standards, constantly on a daily basis, for my own classroom, it kind of blew my mind. I had no idea that when I'd get out to be in a position like this, where I'm supposed to be supporting, hundreds of teachers across the district, that teachers literally don't even know what the coding of those standards even mean.
Just a little bit. This is amazing, everything that you just said, but you've really given me a lesson in how far we have to go. And I feel your pain, because you were probably raised into the position that you're in because you had been applying practice. I think what's actually happening with you, and it's probably happening all across the nation, is that everyone's trying to digitally transition to present curriculum and do all of the back and forth with students digitally. At the same time, they are trying to go in that experiential direction, which is another complexity to the creation of the curriculum, right? Huge. Yeah, so I'm going to go to Wendy. Wendy, what are your comments on this?
A lot. I mean, I agree 100% with what's been said. Phil, first I have to say, when you're talking about getting the teachers to do more hands-on, I have a 9-year-old, and we're reviewing her vocabulary this week, right? And it's just words on paper to her. And it's about energy and energy conservation. And I said, well, here, we're going to go see Mr. Rick, who is a friend of my family who does install solar panels, right? They have a solar farm and they live 5 minutes from me. So that's what we're doing this weekend, right? Just I don't want that love for learning to disappear. So that's a side comment, but I agree with you 100%. And I think you're both absolutely on to the fact that you can't put too much on teachers, right? If you start talking about meta tagging and digging in, they have to know the why. I mean, they really have to understand that. But at the end of the day, what I think I'm hearing, and it's something that I often say, is teachers are not curriculum designers. They're not trained in curriculum design. What you're asking them to do when you're asking them to meta tag and when you're asking them to develop curriculum, that's very different than what they were trained to do. And so, Phil, what you're doing, those baby steps of training, I know it feels very slow, but it's exactly what you're both observing, right? That this isn't exist. It's not a skill set that exists within them. And so that is what you have to do, especially if you're developing your own content. But you're doing that in addition to asking teachers to teach. And it's a lot. And it's putting a lot on them. To go back, Erin, to what you said, there's only so much we can put on teachers. And that's why even, when we bring people in and hire them to develop curriculum, and if they don't have a master's in curriculum development, they have to go through a tremendous training process. And so that's really the difference when you have that commercial grade content or curriculum, is that true curriculum designers and people who have been trained in assessment and aligning that assessment, and it's been tested for validity, right?
And PBL.
Yes, yeah. So anyway, I agree with everything that you're saying, and I could probably go on, but I really think that's the significant difference is, are we putting too much on teachers when we're asking them to develop curriculum? I think so, because I don't think they're trained for that. I think they're trained to facilitate and to teach, and we should give them the tools to personalize learning. And that's why I really like the model of giving that commercial grade curriculum to the teacher, letting it do the AI behind the scenes for those personalized learning pathways, and then letting the teacher facilitate, and that way the teacher can provide that personalized feedback for students. So that's what I hear, and maybe it's because it's what I want to hear, but I agree 100%, and I think the comments have been fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you all for that. This has been really a robust conversation. We've gone a lot of different directions, which is awesome. I'm going to skip through these last couple because we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to go in another direction, and that is number 7 here, ensuring your planning includes digital content systems that enhance aspects of student thinking, analyzing, creativity. Phillip, I think this is where you live right now. You're trying to push that, which is you're on standard. You're leading a standard, which is awesome. But also number 9, which is applying the concept of chunking or partitioning content aimed at the short form reading style of the present generation. This is a really important point about these standards because this generation has a mind modeled after this, okay? It is concise and visual. Concise and visual. It's not long form. It's almost universally short form. That's why TikTok, right? It's also why students tend to reply with short bursts. They're used to text. They're used to video. They live here in short form world, which has an underlying impact on digital design, all instructional design, that very few people are recognizing. So we named it as EduJedi, not me, but somebody else did, as a definite target of responsibility for all teachers to understand the mind maps they're dealing with in the present generation. And the reason why they try to play with their phone under the desk less than 5 minutes after you start lecturing. Even adults can go into meetings and have to remind the fellow adult, please put your phone down. You know, we're having a discussion here, and witness the irritation of the younger people who just want to be in their phone. Boredom is what we want to call it, but it's actually the way people's minds are kind of oriented now. So I want to talk about that. Erin, coming back to you first.
So there's an example. It's kind of funny you bring this up. That's the 60 Minutes talked about how the brain works and why that is. So I'm looking at the panelists, and there's probably several people watching, but if you remember what a rotary phone is, this is the example. So on a rotary phone, you had all 10 of your digits essentially on a rotary, and you had to put your finger in and it had to dial it around. You had to wait for that rotary to spin back to neutral before you could actually move it forward again to dial the next number. So dialing a number went something like 5, 4, 2, and then it would take that time. So we were used to that when we were young. We didn't think anything about it. And then when touchtone phones came in, and it was just 541, 521, 2464, it was literally, you could type the entire phone, all 3 sets of digits, all 10 numbers, faster than you could probably get 2 done on a rotary phone. So it would take roughly 4 or 5 times as long to dial a number. So those of us who had had a rotary phone, it was like we'd get a little dopamine reaction because we could do it so quickly, and so it was just great. But as time progressed and less people had the experience of a rotary phone, they would actually get a negative reaction if they ever had to go back and do that. Like, it would actually literally be on about the 3rd rotation, they would be like, oh my God, why is this taking so long? Mm-hmm. And that's what the brain does. It gets used to certain things. And as it gets used to certain things, if that same context or whatever it is takes longer than what their brain says it is, so many cycles of whatever the cellular ADP conversion is, then it says an alarm, this is taking too long, it's a problem, and it actually causes cortisol and other things in the brain. And that's really what we have to get people to understand. Those of us of a certain age, I guess, Generation X or whatever it is, we still have some patterns of things taking longer than they do now, whereas the children we're working with don't really have that. And it's just escalating through time. It's almost exponentially. And so our teachers still have these constructs of, reading whole books and, watching whole movies or pieces and not extracting out relevant pieces and chunking it and doing what's called remixing, which is where you take that information and chunk it down to short form, and then compile it in a curated set. So what we run into is teachers who believe students need to do things this way versus getting information in a way that their brain is already preset to. What that does is it actually causes cortisol to fill their brain and they become agitated and very upset. The opposite of that would be where they're doing it in your long form pattern, and then they would say, I'm going to multi-channel by picking up my phone and doing something that's filling up this extra time with something that I feel is useful. Because you're giving me, what should take 30 seconds over 5 minutes, and therefore I've got 4.5 minutes of things that my brain's going to be basically punishing me if I don't fill it with something that's more enjoyable. And so the brain chemistry around how that works is important. However, there's another piece to this, LeiLani, which is that short form only skill set is not beneficial to them in the long run. So we have to do both pieces to it. We can't simply just change over education to a short form pattern so that they believe that everything in their life is going to be quick and easily accessible in the exact order it needs to be. Problem solving is around things when they don't go the way our brains think about it. And our students today are somewhat losing that ability to accept when things don't go the way they're supposed to and problem solve around that into a more long form pattern. So education has really two pieces to this. It's not just converting over to using a short form pattern for teaching. It's understanding when it's important to give students practice in long form. And that's in all across the board, because it's actually a problem solving technique that is based very deeply in how our neurology works. And this idea of saying that, yes, we want you to take advantage of this. I'm going to remix things in a way that makes sense to you. However, every once in a while, I am going to make sure that you understand that there are times when, no, go read that manual. Which page? I don't know. The idea is students need to struggle with things. They need to grapple with things, and they don't need everything scaffolded to a level to where they're not actually in their zone of proximal development. And so that's the other piece where it's really difficult for teachers these days to understand a generation that actually has a different brain wiring construct that they have to be able to work in. But they also have to be able to build that within our students, because we're losing aspects that are very important when it comes to creativity and design, problem solving, engineering, these other, deeper mindsets that we actually really need people to be able to do in the long term. And we're losing a lot of that because we're saying, okay, we will transition to this, or we'll only do it in long form. And we're not doing the pieces where we're saying, I'm going to give it to you in the form you want, and then I'm going to scaffold you over to long form so that you can use that in life as a problem solving skill set. So, that's what I'd say about it. There's a lot to that concept that's maybe a little more in depth than people want to go to, and the neuroscience behind it is actually really critical. But it's the part that you have to have. The kids have to be able to do both, especially if you're going to ever try to get them into projects, because something, your plans almost never work perfectly. And if they do, it's not a great project. Your project should actually get them to fail at certain points and have to recreate and problem through that if you really want them to develop higher order thinking skills.
Everything you just said, I'm going to maybe pull it out and make it, its own sort of keynote, because it was awesome. Phillip, I know you're chomping at the bit. What are your comments here?
I would say the last comment there that he made, we would like to refer to that as productive struggle, right? It's you have to provide students the opportunity to engage in a productive struggle and be able to collaborate with each other to come up with after just kind of sharing ideas, to come up with a solution to that potential barrier that is preventing them to move on to the next step. And the other thing kind of that really kind of, when I was listening to that, it reminds me so much of math in particular. When students feel that they could easily access a calculator, and even now there's a thing called photo math, where a kid can literally take their cell phone, because even 8-year-olds have cell phones nowadays, and they can literally take a picture of a standard problem that 20, 30 years ago in a standard classroom, students would be working out of a textbook or a worksheet and completing that out. But now a student can literally take a photo of that exact same problem and solve it within 2 seconds, and they don't even have to think about it. And so unfortunately, especially during a pandemic, that just really elevated that problem because unfortunately they were not receiving very quality instruction to begin with, and they're at home with no one around, no one to really problem solve with or ask questions. They're not getting really high quality instruction, and so they're kind of in survival mode. And what we saw was there were a lot of students who would literally just go to calculators and photo math, and essentially just take pictures of the problem and then give the answer. And then as a result, it would even give them the step-by-step algorithms on how to solve that problem. And so kind of whenever Erin was talking earlier about problem solving, it really, just as whether your project was designed well or not, whether your problems were designed well or not. If a kid can simply just take a picture of that problem and it does it for them, your problem probably wasn't a very good problem to begin with. You probably just wasted their time asking them a question that was a simple procedural step-by-step algorithm, when reality is you didn't provide them an opportunity to actually even use anything of any type of authentic learning to really even understand the why. Because just as Erin and Wendy were talking about earlier about how educators need to know the why behind what they're doing and why they're making decisions in order to be a better teacher, students need to know the why about why you're trying to use their time that is to do things that were going to take a very long amount of time when they could easily just get it done so much faster. But if you're going to give them something that's of quality and something that's actually going to make them think and be authentic learners, then it's going to be a struggle, and it's okay. They don't have to know the answer right away. That's when you know you've given them something of value, is that they actually have to think about it and collaborate and produce. But whenever all you have to do is, if all you're doing is giving them an assignment that they could just take a picture and it gives them the answer within 2 seconds, you wasted their time.
Excellent points. Okay, well, I know I could have had Zach do a little share, but we're down to our 3-minute mark here. Zach, you'll be on deck in the next event on the chunking thing. Coming back to Wendy as we wrap this up, like your thoughts on the commercial side of causing these things from a pro instructional design digital view.
Yeah, one of the biggest things to consider on the instructional design side is learner comprehension and chunking that content for design. But what I just heard in the conversation that I'm really excited about is student-student interaction and student-teacher interaction. And all of that, if you're taking commercial content and implementing it in the classroom, all of that is really the fidelity of implementation. Right? And that comes down to training of the teachers and the pedagogy within the classroom. And I think that is so exciting. But the dependency there is on your partner on the commercial side, because the other thing that I'm hearing is rigor. And oftentimes people think rigor means keeping them busy and making it harder. But I'm so excited to hear that we're talking about rigor being the quality. Is it authentic? Are we in those higher levels of blooms, those higher levels of webs, collaborating? Because that's what rigor really is. And if you're giving those rigorous assignments that are authentic and connected to the real world, where they're collaborating and they're actually thinking, right, and they're engaged, then you're teaching. But giving them these just silly multiple choice, right, just to keep them busy or clicking through the course, that's not rigor, and you're not teaching. It's not authentic. So, you know, in an ideal situation, your teachers are facilitating, they're using that commercial content that actually has learning targets that students are meeting. And you're doing that with student-student collaboration, student-teacher collaboration, and that all boils down to the instructional design of the actual content that you're getting from your partner.
Really excellent points. Authentic, and then everything Erin said about modality. Short form, but make sure there's some long form in there, because we need students to develop that skill. It's really a skill. This has been a really excellent conversation. We got to really walk through a lot of these standards and their reason for being. A lot of notes were taken so that we can add in a lot of these comments for the standards when they're reiterated back out in the next edition of the reference guide. So I want to thank everybody. Erin, as always, you're completely awesome, and thank you for your dialogue in today's event. And Phillip, awesome as well. And I congratulate you and your school district on going down this road. Probably won't be a completely easy road, but it's the right one. And Wendy and Zach, thank you so much for your comments. You know, it's good to know. It's good to know what's going on the commercial side, the pro grade side, and what's happening. So our next event, September 27th, we're going to come back to talking about these standards in particular again, with a focus on the mix of digital design elements. So looking forward to seeing you then. Thanks everyone for participating, and we're free to move about again. Thank you for being here. Goodbye for now. Bye, Phillip. Bye, Erin. Bye, Zach. Bye, Wendy.